Hello, good evening. I'm Jonathan Rowson, Director of the Social Brain Centre here at the RSA, and I'm very glad to extend a soulful welcome this evening. We have a wonderful guest to speak in a moment. I'll introduce Ian shortly, but I just wanted to take a moment to, first of all, some housekeeping. Your phones, please, on silent, but you're welcome to tweet, indeed encouraged to do so, and the hashtag is #RSA Spirituality. So do be active there if you feel like it. We are recording this event, so keep that in mind. When you ask a question later, introduce yourself briefly for posterity. We also have a big live audience, I believe. I was particularly intrigued to hear there's people watching from a live streaming event in Guernsey, and Ian's a long-time resident of the Isle of Skye, so we have a big small island community kind of theme going on tonight. This event takes place in the context of a broader project, as some of you know. It's called Spirituality, Tools of the Mind and the Social Brain. It's roughly an 18-month project. And it's broadly about how rethinking human nature might help us to reconceive spirituality and think better of its sort of purpose and value. And we've been doing that through a variety of private events at the RSA as part of our research process that will lead to a final report. But we've also been doing it with public events. We had an opening event broadly exploring rethinking spirituality, trying to get away from the kind of hijacking of the term by the New Age and thinking a bit more deeply about how we might use it. And in the second event, we had Guy Claxton speaking about embodied cognition and the role of the fundamentally embodied nature of a lot of a spiritual experience. And tonight we have a talk exploring the soul. Now, Ian is someone I'm very glad to introduce. If you haven't read his book, The Master and His Emissary, you're just letting the best in life pass you by. It's a really extraordinary work, and it's the product of, sometimes you hear that line, a luminous mind at the peak of its powers. It's that kind of thing. It's really an amazing work, and Ian has the rare sort of ability to sort of traverse neuroscience and the humanities with sort of equal sort of authority and bowls. He knows his kind of dopamine from his serotonin, but he also knows his Sartre from his Heidegger or whatever. So it's that kind of breadth of vision that I was keen for him to bring to bear on this important question tonight. So without further ado, Ian McGilchrist.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming. Jonathan asked me to do this, and I sort of foolishly said yes, and I feel a complete fraud, actually, because, well, I don't really know anything about the soul, and the only thing that consoles me is that probably very few other people do either, so you'll have to just cut me some slack anyway. There was a piece in the papers not very long ago by a quite well-known team in America who do neuroimaging, and they're particularly interested in moral values. And they found that by suppressing activity in the right temporoparietal region, they caused a failure to understand the nature of moral judgments. Well, this wasn't a surprise to me. Anyone who knows my book would suggest that that was probably going to happen. They set up a scenario of Grace hoping to put sugar in her friend's coffee, but actually, by mistake, putting poison in, and she died. In the other scenario, Grace intended to poison her friend, but put sugar in, and the friend lived. In the normal state, we probably think it was worse to intend to poison, but the good old left hemisphere, on its own, thought in what is basically an autistic way that the outcome was the important measure. Well, that's all very interesting. But then these neuroscientists, I won't mention their names to spare them their blushes here, finished up by saying, if something as complex as morality has a mechanical explanation, it'll be hard to argue that people have or need a soul. Well, I hope you can see that there might be a category mistake there. Everything that goes through human experience has its brain correlates, but of course it doesn't mean that that's all there is to it. So is the concept of the soul a redundant idea now that science has made us see it as a superstition? Or are we actually turning our backs on something very important, simply because we can't satisfy demands for precision and proof. And in fact, are we making a category mistake? So I'm going to ask today two questions. What use is the soul as an idea? And I think I have an answer to that. I think it has a use. And I'm also going to ask, if so, what might the soul be like? And about that, I'm afraid, I am less certain, but I'm going to have a go. I expect a lot of us would sympathize with the soldier of Marlborough's before the Battle of Blenheim, who was reportedly heard praying, "O God, if there be a God, save my soul, if I have a soul." And nowadays it's become a kind of embarrassment to talk about the soul, and yet until now it has been central to most cultures. The word has disappeared, and language is an aspect of reality. If it's true, as Wittgenstein said, that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language, making something disappear by language could bewitch us into thinking it didn't exist. So let's think in simple terms. Can this word be substituted? Well, it seems to me to place the person in a widest context, a context outside the confines of immediate time and space, and even to involve an idea of destiny. So, for example, Othello's great lines, "It is the cause, my soul, let me not name it to you chaste stars, it is the cause." It would be difficult to replace that with, it is the cause, my mind, my brain, my emotions, my will, my what. Equally, that famous poem of W.E. Henley's Invictus, "I am the captain of my soul. I am the captain of my mind, my brain, my emotions, my what." It seems that the concept has a meaning, which we can't exactly say what it is, but it, as I say, sets the human being in a broad context, not the narrow context of where we're encountering the person. And it seems to have this idea of a destiny. And so one gets the idea of Keats's, that the world is a veil of soul-making. What did he mean? He didn't mean that we grow up intellectually. He didn't mean that we got better at being moral citizens. He didn't mean that something happened to our heart exactly, although it could have involved bits of all of those. He meant something bigger and deeper. So is our sense of the spiritual something like our moral sense? Well, it certainly has something of that, but it goes beyond it, doesn't it? There's a rather marvellous moment in a play of Iris Murdoch's called Above the Gods. The character says, "In a way, goodness and truth seem to come out of the depths of the soul. And when we really know something, we feel we've always known it. Yet also, it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. It's like beyond the world, not in the clouds or in heaven, but a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is." I'll come back to those words. But they put me in mind, she was a Platonist, of Plato's speaking of philosophy in the 7th letter. He says, "For philosophy doesn't admit of exposition like other branches of knowledge, but after much converse about the matter and a life lived together, suddenly a light, as it were, is kindled in one soul by a flame that leaps to it from another and thereafter sustains itself." So thinking and moral reasoning are part of it, but what both those passages seem to suggest to me is there is something deeper, more transcendent, over which we have less power and that comes to us. So is it to do with emotion? That's another possible idea, because after all, we say soulful often means with emotion. And I think that might be right. But there's a kind of realm in which we can respond to art. I'm thinking particularly of music, for which the word emotion is wrong. Sean, can we have the music? View is the Kyrie, so-called Le Roi or Le Roy, by the 16th century John Taverner. And it strikes me, and has always struck me, that we don't have words for the way in which that works. It is intellectually pleasing, it is, I suppose, emotionally something, but it is, above all, spiritually whatever it is. There just seems to me no two ways about it. No one thinks of phrases. The psalmist says, "Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou so disquieted within me?" You could say somebody is unhappy. You could say this is sadness. And in a way that's right, depending on what we mean. But if you think of this as the words of a soldier encountering the realities of the life of combat, or a refugee fleeing from such a world, or just a bereaved soul, as we say, it seems to me that it's more than that. And perhaps also the case of depression and so on is not really sadness. Is it perhaps a soul sickness? Psychiatrists, after all, the word means soul doctors, and in German there was the idea that doctors were ministering to die Seele, which is a hard thing to define, but that's the point. We need a word that's hard to define, because if we define it, we'll probably miss the point altogether. Well, let's get a little bit less defined. It could be sort of imagination, something like that. And indeed, again, it often involves imagination, but it surely is other than that and goes beyond it. And there's plenty of imagination which is not in the service of the soul at all. In a book called Logos of the Soul by a follower of Jung called Christou, talking about Jung's idea of the soul, he comments, "A person who spent his life in a cell may have enriched and deepened his soul. And this wouldn't mean, moreover, that he spent his time accumulating fantasies or writing learned treatises." It's not intellectual or imaginative in the term of fantasies. But it's probably more imaginative in the way that Wordsworth used the idea, become a living soul. There are overlaps now. Well, okay, it's not any of those things precisely, but could it be a something that stands over against our embodied existence? Well, I think there's two things wrong with that. The one is that it's not a thing, and the other is that it's not over against our embodied existence. Like matter, according to Whitehead and Bergson, the soul seems to me to be process, more process than a thing. We come back to the phrase, a veil of soul making. Perhaps not all souls are equal. Perhaps we have to grow our souls. Perhaps souls can be so thwarted that they're almost extinguished. And many people who've talked about the soul have used imagery of fire or water, which are things that are more like energy processes. For example, Eckhart's Funkellein, the little spark, the scintilla animae, the soul spark, which comes from, corresponds to, and reaches out again to the divine. A potentiality, in other words, something in the process of happening, a latent function that needs to be nourished to grow and expand. And nowadays it's not popular to say that there is a value to suffering, and I'm certainly not suggesting that suffering is ever anything that anyone should or would want to invite into their life. But it is part of the experience of suffering sometimes that it does deepen one's sense of what it means to be alive. A poet that I like very much, Henry Vaughan, had the concept of, well, he had a collection of poems, in fact, called the Silex Scintillans, which means the sparking flint, the flint from which the spark comes. And of course it comes when it's struck. It comes from the heart and is the spark that is involved in and nourished by suffering. Then I think of that phrase of Wordsworth after his brother was drowned in the Abergavenny, I think it was. A deep distress hath humanized my soul. And thinking of water, one would think of the Tao, the flow of life, which is not far from a kind of world soul, really, and the flow that is in Heraclitus, where everything is flow at the heart. Of course, in Heraclitus you get imagery both of flow and of fire. Heraclitus has everything. And I remember also a wonderful film, which I thought was just too complicated to show you a clip of that tonight. But I'm very fond of a number of films by Andrei Tarkovsky. One of them I'm thinking of is Solaris. If you think you've seen Solaris because you saw a terrible American film made in the 1990s, you haven't. You need to see the Russian film made in, I think, 1974, which is, I think, one of the most moving and philosophically fascinating films ever made. And it really shows somebody through the imagination of somebody that loves them, and through their being imagined, and through their experience of suffering, actually growing a soul and coming to life. It's a science fiction film. It's extremely eerie, and it's extremely beautiful. So there's a sort of resonance that brings this soul to life between the two characters, Chris and Hari, in that story. And I think that's a good image of how we grow a soul, if we do grow a soul, in this resonant area. But we need to have a sort of disposition, and perhaps that is the soul. Perhaps the soul is a disposition towards life, a disposition that's both rapt and reflective and makes a living process possible, that opens a space. And here James Hillman, another disciple, if you like, of Jung, says, I think, putting it rather well, the soul is less an object of knowledge than it is a way of knowing the object, a way of knowing knowledge itself. So it's not really a thing, it's a disposition, a manner, an attitude, a way of being, and a process, it seems to me. And it isn't contrary to the body, although when in the past it was conceived, one died, this soul was the thing that was left over, as it were. And I'm at the college at Oxford, of which I'm lucky enough to be a Quondam Fellow, is called All Souls. It's actually, its full name is All Souls of the Faithful Departed. In fact, I think it's of the Faithful Departed at Agincourt. But that is the idea of the soul as what's left of people once they've died. And, of course, that is a very rich idea, and I'm not dismissing it. But it does rather lead to the idea that it's something separate from the body. Incidentally, those who don't like the college take great pleasure in pointing out that the French for All Souls College is Collège des Morts. But once again, Wittgenstein put his finger on it when he said the human body is the best picture of the human soul. And the soul is intangible, perhaps, but still embodied. And in every culture, images of breath, force, or motion, such as in Greek, pneuma and psyche, ideas of breath, and the same ideas exist in Hebrew, which is not a language I know, but there are the words, I believe, ruach and nefesh, which are words for soul, which are derived from the idea of breath. And of course, that is the image of God making man by breathing soul breathing his soul into the clay, into the living clay. And without that, the soul becomes something rather nebulous. Without that embodied nature, it becomes terribly tenuous. And it reminds me of Hadrian's description of his soul as animula, vagula, blandula, that poor little wavering, vague, and sort of smooth little creature that slips away out of your mind. So it's important to remember that the soul is embodied, and it's deep also in instincts and intuitions, which is probably one of the ways whereby we contact it. And one shouldn't try to cut those out of the idea of the soul in order to make it noble. There was, in the Nazi era, as you know, great festivals of the burnings of books. And Freud's books were among those that were consigned to the flames. And those who threw the books into the fire were enjoined to chant the following words: in defiance of the soul-corroding glorification of instinctual life, and in the name of the nobility of the human soul, I commit to the flames the writings of Sigmund Freud. C.S.